I'm Alex, and I just heard a story so shocking, I had to share it with you. Rebecca Harper had it all: a successful husband, a dream home, and a life straight out of a magazine. But one careless mistake shattered the illusion. A secret exposed. A betrayal too close to home. But Rebecca? She wasn't the type to break, she was the type to strike back. Stay with me, because this story is just getting started. Rebecca Harper's life was a carefully crafted masterpiece. Every morning in her elegant Chestnut Hill mansion, she brewed organic Colombian coffee, arranged a perfect breakfast of eggs Benedict on fine china, and watched her husband Jonathan skim through his emails at their sleek marble kitchen island. Their world, framed by towering maple trees and polished cherrywood floors, was a portrait of success, flawless, enviable, untouchable. From the outside, Rebecca had everything: a loving husband, a luxurious home, financial security, and a carefully nurtured image of domestic perfection. She had devoted years to supporting Jonathan's rise in the pharmaceutical industry, sacrificing her own ambitions so he could reach the coveted position of vice president at Hawthorne Biotech. His $850,000 salary provided them with every material comfort: designer suits, Michelin-starred dinners, summers in the Hamptons. It was a life others envied. A life Rebecca had built with unwavering precision. But lately something felt off. The late nights at the office stretched later. The business trips became more frequent. The scent of a different cologne lingered on his clothes, a deeper, muskier fragrance than the one she had always bought for him. He was more absent, both physically and emotionally, offering vague excuses about project deadlines and executive meetings. Rebecca wasn't the kind of woman to ignore patterns. She had spent years perfecting her role as the wife who anticipated every detail, selecting the right tie for his board meetings, ensuring his Rolex collection was serviced on time, balancing their social calendar with meticulous care. She noticed everything. And lately, what she noticed didn't add up. Then came the mistake. That morning, Jonathan was in a rush, shoving his Rimowa suitcase into the walk-in closet and selecting a crisp Tom Ford suit. His movements were hurried, tense. Usually, Rebecca would have prepared everything for his business trips the night before: his documents, his outfits, even a handwritten itinerary to keep him organized. But this time, he hadn't asked. He hadn't even mentioned a trip. "A sudden meeting in Chicago," he murmured, barely glancing at her as he packed. "I have to present the final clinical trial report for the new drug. I'll be back in 2 days." Rebecca's gaze flickered to the Patek Philippe watch he fastened around his wrist. The $80,000 timepiece had been his reward for securing a massive contract last year. The same watch she had personally gifted him. He kissed her forehead lightly, the scent of his unfamiliar cologne stronger than usual. Then he was gone. Rebecca stood by the grand entrance, watching his BMW disappear down the driveway, the tail lights fading into the morning mist. Her instincts whispered what her heart refused to hear. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. Instead, she went to her study, took a sip of her untouched coffee, and unlocked her phone. Scrolling through Instagram was part of her morning routine, a habit she had maintained to stay connected with her younger sister, Madison Carter, a rising influencer with over 200,000 followers. Madison's life was a parade of brunches, designer handbags, and luxury getaways, all carefully documented in curated snapshots. Then Rebecca saw the post. A photo, taken poolside at the Ritz-Carlton Miami. Madison, in a flowing white Dior resort dress, sunglasses perched on her nose, a champagne flute in hand. Rebecca's eyes moved instinctively to the edge of the frame, to the tanned, muscular arm resting on the lounge chair beside her sister. And on that wrist? A Patek Philippe watch. Jonathan's watch. The same one he had left with just hours ago, supposedly en route to Chicago. Rebecca's heart didn't pound. Her breath didn't quicken. She simply zoomed in. The distinct dial, the leather band, the engraved serial number, she knew them all by heart. Her husband wasn't in Chicago. He was in Miami. With her sister. Then, as if the universe wanted to confirm the betrayal, her phone buzzed. An email alert from her American Express Platinum card. Rebecca exhaled slowly as she clicked the notification. Ritz-Carlton Miami Presidential Suite. 2 nights. $114,000. Jonathan had used her card. A muscle in her jaw tightened. She could picture it now, the effortless arrogance, the sheer carelessness. He had become so comfortable, so sure of her blind loyalty, that he had made the fatal mistake of assuming she would never look. She set her phone down carefully, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of her study, and gazed out at their immaculate garden. Designed by the same landscape architects who had worked on Central Park, the space was a vision of carefully controlled beauty. Much like her marriage had been. Rebecca wasn't the kind of woman who screamed. She wasn't the kind of woman who crumbled. She was the kind of woman who planned. She walked back to her desk, powered on her MacBook, and opened a folder she had created 3 months ago. Because she had suspected. Now, she had proof. Surveillance photos. Receipts from Michelin-starred restaurants. Hotel bookings. Late-night credit card charges. Madison's social media posts flaunting new designer bags, Cartier jewelry, first-class flights, all things she shouldn't have been able to afford. Rebecca smiled. Jonathan thought he was in control. He had no idea who he was married to. She clicked open Hawthorne Biotech's Executive Policy Manual and scrolled to the section on termination due to personal misconduct. A specific clause, highlighted in yellow, caught her eye. Executives engaged in conduct detrimental to the company's reputation, including but not limited to extramarital affairs resulting in financial misuse, are subject to termination without severance. Perfect. She reached for her phone. There was one call she needed to make. Detective Graham? It's time. Rebecca Harper wasn't just about to expose an affair. She was about to ruin 2 lives. And she was going to enjoy every moment of it. Rebecca Harper sat at her antique mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the rim of her untouched coffee cup. The liquid had long since gone cold, much like the foundation of her marriage. She was no longer the woman who ignored warning signs, who dismissed intuition as mere paranoia. No, she was a woman armed with truth. The moment she saw the Patek Philippe watch on her sister's Instagram post, she knew the illusion had shattered. Jonathan was in Miami, not Chicago. The same man who had sworn loyalty to her for 15 years was now indulging in a lavish getaway with her own sister. But she did not weep. She did not rage. She strategized. Her phone buzzed with another notification from American Express Platinum, confirming the $114,000 charge at the Ritz-Carlton Presidential Suite. Jonathan's arrogance was his downfall. He had become so complacent, so entitled, that he had used her own card to finance his betrayal. Rebecca inhaled slowly, pushing away the emotions that threatened to cloud her judgment. She was no victim. She was about to remind Jonathan exactly who he had underestimated. She turned to her laptop, fingers gliding over the keys with measured precision. A folder named Contingency Plan sat waiting, a collection of documents, receipts, and legal precedents she had begun assembling 3 months ago when the first seeds of doubt had been planted. She opened the files methodically, reviewing every detail. Bank statements showing suspicious withdrawals from their joint account. Hotel receipts from luxury suites booked under aliases. Surveillance photos of Jonathan and Madison at Michelin-starred restaurants, their intimacy unmistakable. Credit card charges for designer jewelry and handbags, purchased of course with her money. Every piece of evidence painted a picture of deception, entitlement, and greed. But Rebecca wasn't just after confirmation. She needed leverage. Her next move was clear. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had saved weeks ago, anticipating this moment. Detective Graham? It is time. The seasoned investigator's voice came through, calm and professional. Mrs. Harper, I assume you have enough to proceed? More than enough, she replied, her voice even, devoid of hesitation. I need you to track financial transactions, any company funds misused, any expenses that tie this affair to Jonathan's corporate account. She knew Hawthorne Biotech had strict policies regarding executive misconduct, especially when company funds were involved. If Jonathan had even once paid for a luxury dinner, a hotel suite, or a private jet with his corporate card, it could lead to termination without severance. And she was willing to bet everything he had. Consider it done, Detective Graham assured her. Rebecca set the phone down, her mind already 3 steps ahead. Her next call was to Jonathan's executive assistant, a sharp woman named Eleanor Monroe, who had always admired Rebecca's composure and intellect. Eleanor, Rebecca greeted smoothly. I am afraid there is a sensitive issue that requires discretion. Do you mind checking something for me? A brief pause, then a cautious reply. Of course, Mrs. Harper. How can I help? I need details on Jonathan's corporate expenses over the past 6 months. Any large transactions, personal trips masked as business travel, or anything that seems inappropriate. Eleanor hesitated. Mrs. Harper, is this about? Yes, Rebecca confirmed. And before you worry, I will handle this quietly. But I need to know the extent of his betrayal, both personal and professional. Another silence. Then a resigned sigh. I will send you everything by tomorrow. Rebecca smiled, a sharp calculated victory blooming in her chest. Jonathan was about to lose everything. But she wasn't done. She needed to see it for herself. That night, while Jonathan was likely lounging in Miami, sipping champagne with Madison, Rebecca drove to their favorite restaurant, Latelier on Beacon Street. She had made a standing reservation there for over a decade, a place that had once symbolized their love, their shared ambition. Tonight, she was meeting Detective Graham. When he arrived, he slid a thick manila envelope across the table. You were right, he said, his voice laced with professional detachment. He's been funding their affair through a mix of personal and corporate funds. Multiple hotel stays, designer purchases, even a weekend at a private villa in Aspen, all written off as business expenses. Rebecca let out a soft, humorless laugh. Jonathan had been sloppy, arrogant. And now, his downfall was inevitable. She flipped through the photos inside the envelope. Jonathan, pulling out a chair for Madison. His hand grazing her waist. A Cartier bracelet Rebecca had once admired now resting on Madison's wrist. The final picture made her fingers tighten. Jonathan, brushing a strand of hair from Madison's face, looking at her with the same adoration he once reserved for Rebecca. For a fleeting moment, pain flickered beneath the surface of her resolve. 15 years. 15 years of devotion, of loyalty, of standing by him through every triumph and setback. And this is what it had amounted to? But she swallowed it down. Because this wasn't about heartbreak anymore. This was war. She closed the folder and met Graham's gaze. What is your next move? He asked. Rebecca's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. Tomorrow, I walk into Hawthorne Biotech's corporate office and present this to HR. And when she did, Jonathan wouldn't just lose his marriage. He would lose his career, his reputation, his financial security. Madison would be left with a disgraced, unemployed man who couldn't even afford the lifestyle she craved. And Rebecca? She would walk away with everything. The storm was coming. And Rebecca Harper was the one holding the thunder. Rebecca Harper was not a woman to act impulsively. Every move she made was deliberate, calculated, and designed for maximum impact. That was what had made her an exceptional strategist in both her marriage and her social circle. And now, that same meticulous planning would be Jonathan's undoing. She spent the night assembling her arsenal of evidence, financial records, surveillance photos, and a carefully curated timeline that proved Jonathan had not only betrayed her but had misused corporate funds to finance his affair. If he thought he could walk away unscathed, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. With a deep breath, Rebecca sat at her desk and drafted an email to Hawthorne Biotech's Human Resources Department, requesting a confidential meeting with Thomas Caldwell, the head of corporate compliance. She kept the language professional, her tone measured. There was no emotion in her words, only facts, irrefutable, damning facts. Her one condition? The meeting needed to happen today. She knew the corporate machine well enough to predict what would follow. Scandal was a liability. A senior executive caught in an affair that involved misappropriated company funds was not something Hawthorne Biotech could afford, especially not with a major FDA approval on the line. By 9 a.m., the response arrived. Confirmed, 11 a.m., Executive Review Board meeting. Rebecca allowed herself a small, victorious smile. She closed her laptop, slid her carefully prepared evidence dossier into her Louis Vuitton briefcase, and walked to her closet. This was not just any meeting. This was a battle, and she would dress accordingly. She chose a navy blue Chanel tweed jacket, tailored to perfection, and paired it with a silk blouse and fitted pencil skirt, an ensemble that exuded both confidence and quiet dominance. She had spent 15 years standing beside Jonathan, supporting his rise to power. Now, she was going to watch him fall. By the time she stepped into the sleek glass headquarters of Hawthorne Biotech, the weight of the moment settled in. This was it. This was the day she took back control. Rebecca was escorted into a private boardroom on the 45th floor. Across from her sat Thomas Caldwell, the company's HR director, along with Sarah Lawson, the firm's lead corporate attorney. They greeted her politely, but their body language was rigid, their expressions neutral, professionals bracing for a storm. "Mrs. Harper," Caldwell began, folding his hands on the table, "I understand you requested a meeting regarding your husband, Jonathan Harper. What is the nature of your concerns?" Rebecca didn't flinch. She reached into her briefcase, pulled out a neatly organized stack of documents, and slid them across the table. "This," she said smoothly, "is a detailed account of Jonathan Harper's misconduct." The silence in the room was palpable as Caldwell and Lawson skimmed through hotel receipts, unauthorized corporate expenses, and surveillance photos that left no room for doubt. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, watching them absorb the evidence. "To be clear," she continued, her voice unwavering, "I am not here to discuss personal grievances. This is about corporate ethics. As you can see, Jonathan has been using company funds to finance his affair. I believe Hawthorne Biotech has a strict policy on executive misconduct, does it not?" Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Yes, we do." He turned to the attorney, who had begun flipping through Jonathan's expense reports, cross-referencing them with corporate policies. "This is substantial," Lawson admitted, her brows furrowing. "If this information is accurate, it could constitute grounds for immediate dismissal." Rebecca tilted her head, feigning mild curiosity. "And what would that entail?" Caldwell exhaled sharply. "Termination without severance. Forfeiture of all stock options and bonuses. It would also be damaging to his career, to say the least." Rebecca's fingers traced the gold clasp of her briefcase as she absorbed the confirmation. "Perfect. And of course," she added smoothly, "I am prepared to ensure that this information remains within the company's discretion, as long as Jonathan resigns immediately and agrees to my divorce terms without contest." Caldwell exchanged a glance with the attorney, both understanding exactly what she was offering. Silence hung in the air. Then, finally, Caldwell nodded. "We will proceed with an internal review immediately." Rebecca smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't just satisfaction, but victory. At exactly 1:30 p.m., Jonathan was summoned to corporate headquarters. Rebecca watched from behind the glass walls of the executive lounge as he strode into the building, his usual confidence evident in his gait. He had no idea what was waiting for him inside that boardroom. He was still living in the illusion that he was untouchable. By 2:15 p.m., the reality hit. A company-wide email was sent to senior executives. Effective immediately, Jonathan Harper is no longer employed at Hawthorne Biotech. Rebecca read it once. Then again. And then, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The empire Jonathan had built, the power, the prestige, the influence, was now reduced to nothing. Jonathan stumbled out of the boardroom 30 minutes later, his expression ashen, his once impeccable composure now fractured. Rebecca stood waiting near the elevator bank, arms crossed. When he saw her, his eyes burned with anger, disbelief. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded. Rebecca didn't blink. She simply smiled. "Oh, Jonathan," she said, tilting her head. "I told you. You should have been more careful." She reached into her handbag and pulled out one final envelope. His gaze flickered to them, then back to her, realization dawning like a slow-moving storm. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low, but there was no real conviction in his words. Rebecca stepped forward, leaning in just enough to let him hear her clearly. "Oh, darling," she whispered, her voice dripping with quiet satisfaction. "It already is." And with that, she turned on her heel, stepped into the waiting elevator, and let the doors close between them. As the elevator descended, Rebecca felt lighter than she had in years. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of something greater. She had torn down the illusion of perfection that had trapped her for too long. And now? She was finally free. Rebecca Harper had always believed that power was an illusion, fragile, fleeting, and dependent on the perception of others. Jonathan had spent years constructing his own illusion, an image of invincibility, the golden boy of Hawthorne Biotech, the executive who could do no wrong. But illusions, no matter how carefully crafted, always shattered under the weight of undeniable truth. And Rebecca was the one holding the hammer. She sat at her desk, her hands steady as she flipped through the latest financial reports Detective Graham had sent her. The final confirmation she needed: Jonathan had indeed used company funds to finance his affair. Private jets, luxury suites, a $30,000 shopping spree at Cartier, all hidden under vague descriptions of business development expenses. This wasn't just infidelity anymore. This was fraud. Rebecca exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just going to take Jonathan down. She was going to erase him. At 10 a.m., she walked into the headquarters of Hawthorne Biotech, heels clicking against the marble floors, her Chanel tweed jacket tailored to perfection. She had spent 15 years in Jonathan's shadow, playing the role of the dutiful wife, the silent supporter. Today, she was no one's shadow. As she stepped into the executive boardroom, she was met with the sharp, assessing gazes of Thomas Caldwell, Sarah Lawson, and two other senior partners. Jonathan was already there, seated at the long mahogany table, his expression unreadable. "Rebecca," he greeted, his voice neutral. But she saw the tension in his jaw, the slight twitch in his fingers. He knew. She took her seat across from him, unzipping her Louis Vuitton briefcase with deliberate precision. Without a word, she slid a folder of documents across the table. Sarah Lawson, the company's lead corporate attorney, opened it first. Her sharp eyes flicked from receipt to receipt, her frown deepening. Caldwell followed, his expression darkening as he scanned the bank statements, corporate expense reports, and private investigator findings. "What is this?" Jonathan's voice was controlled, but Rebecca could hear the edge of panic beneath it. Caldwell set down the papers with a quiet finality. "This," he said coolly, "is evidence of corporate misconduct and misuse of company funds." Jonathan's eyes flickered to Rebecca. She only smiled. He turned back to Caldwell. "This is ridiculous. Those were business expenses." "Were they?" Caldwell leaned forward, flipping through the highlighted purchases. "Because unless your mistress purchasing a $12,000 Chanel bag is part of Hawthorne Biotech's new pharmaceutical strategy, I would say this is a clear violation of corporate ethics." Silence. Rebecca watched as Jonathan's carefully crafted composure fractured. "I am willing to resolve this quietly," she said smoothly, leaning back in her chair. "If Jonathan agrees to immediate resignation and signs off on our divorce settlement without contest, this information stays in this room." Caldwell exchanged a look with Sarah Lawson. "That," Sarah said, "would be the best option for everyone." Jonathan laughed. A short, sharp sound of disbelief. "You think you can blackmail me into resigning?" he sneered. Rebecca tilted her head, considering him. "Oh, Jonathan," she murmured, "this isn't blackmail." She reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive, setting it gently on the table. "This," she continued, "contains every financial transaction, every hotel booking, every wire transfer you made in the last 6 months. If you don't resign today, I will personally ensure that this reaches the board of directors, the SEC, and every major financial news outlet in the country." Jonathan's face drained of color. "Make your choice," she said softly. "Because the only thing standing between you and complete professional ruin is how quickly you sign that resignation letter." At 1 p.m., a company-wide email was sent. "Effective immediately, Jonathan Harper has stepped down from his position as vice president of Hawthorne Biotech." Rebecca watched the words appear on her screen, felt the weight of 15 years of betrayal and sacrifice finally lift from her shoulders. It was over. Jonathan was no longer a powerful executive, a respected leader, an untouchable man. He was nothing. By 3 p.m., his company access was revoked. His corporate credit card was cancelled. His name was wiped from the executive directory. By 5 p.m., his luxury apartment lease was voided. Without his 6-figure salary, he couldn't afford the payments. By 7 p.m., his former business partners stopped returning his calls. And by midnight, Jonathan Harper had gone from a man of wealth and influence to a man scrambling for damage control. Rebecca sat in her study that evening, swirling a glass of vintage wine, savoring the quiet. Her phone buzzed. Madison just posted a tearful Instagram story. "Looks like the luxury brand sponsorships are pulling out. Want me to forward the contracts?" Rebecca smiled. Of course they were. With Jonathan unemployed, his reputation in shambles, and no steady flow of wealth, Madison was nothing more than an Instagram personality without financial backing. No more expensive gifts. No more high-end vacations. No more invitations to exclusive parties. Rebecca typed back a response. "No need. She's already lost everything that mattered to her." She set her phone down, exhaling deeply. She had spent years building someone else's empire, sacrificing her own ambitions for the sake of a marriage that had never been real. That ended today. Tomorrow, she would wake up in a world where she was in control, where she dictated the terms, where she was free. She raised her glass in a silent toast to herself, to the woman who had finally taken back her life, and to the man who would never recover from losing her. Rebecca Harper had always imagined that the end of her marriage would feel like a collapse, a crumbling of everything she had built, a weight too heavy to bear. But now, as she stepped into the sunlight outside Hawthorne Biotech's headquarters, she realized something unexpected. It did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like a beginning. Jonathan was gone, his career, reputation, and financial security destroyed in a single day. Madison, her once beloved sister, had been reduced to a fading social media presence, abandoned by luxury brands that once courted her. The two people who had betrayed her the most were now struggling to survive without the wealth and power they had taken for granted. And Rebecca? She was free. For the first time in 15 years, Rebecca woke up without dread. Her mornings no longer revolved around brewing coffee for a husband who barely noticed her, no longer filled with the pressure of maintaining a perfectly curated life. Instead, she focused on herself. She had always been the woman behind the success of others, managing Jonathan's schedule, supporting his career, ensuring their life appeared flawless. But now, she would build something of her own. With a divorce settlement that left her financially secure, Rebecca poured her energy into a new venture, a luxury boutique hotel in Beacon Hill. It started as an idea, a way to reclaim the control, intelligence, and creativity she had suppressed for years. But within months, Maple House transformed from a concept into reality. A restored 19th-century mansion. 12 exclusive suites, each designed with sophistication and charm. A waiting list that grew by the day, attracting elite clientele from around the world. And at the center of it all? Rebecca. She was no longer just a wife, an accessory to someone else's success. She was a businesswoman, a leader, a woman who had risen from the ashes of betrayal stronger than ever. While Rebecca thrived, Jonathan's descent into irrelevance was swift. Without his position at Hawthorne Biotech, his job prospects were grim. A corporate scandal, an exposed affair, and a reputation as a man who had lost everything made him untouchable in the industry. No company wanted the risk. No investor wanted to back a man whose public humiliation had been whispered about in boardrooms across Boston. By the time his severance package dried up, Jonathan was forced to downsize from his penthouse to a modest apartment in Cambridge, his collection of luxury watches sold one by one to cover his dwindling expenses. He had once told Rebecca that power and wealth were everything. Now, he had neither. Madison's collapse was even more public. Her Instagram following plummeted. Luxury brands dropped her overnight. The glamorous lifestyle she flaunted online disappeared, leaving her with nothing but desperation and regret. When she reached out to Rebecca, her messages were met with silence. Rebecca had spent a lifetime putting Madison first, protecting her, giving her everything. But Madison had made her choice. And Rebecca had no reason to save her anymore. One evening, Rebecca stood on the rooftop terrace of Maple House, overlooking the twinkling lights of Boston's skyline. The air was crisp, the city alive, and for the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. "Mrs. Harper, your guests have arrived," her concierge Sarah called from the doorway. Rebecca turned, a glass of vintage champagne in hand, and smiled. She had built something extraordinary. Not for Jonathan. Not for Madison. Not for anyone else. For herself. And this? This was just the beginning. If this story touched your heart, like this video to show your support. Comment 1 if you believe family always finds a way back together. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping real-life stories that touch the soul. Life has a way of revealing truths we don't always want to see. Rebecca Harper spent 15 years believing in loyalty, in love, in the idea that if she gave enough, supported enough, sacrificed enough, her marriage would last. But sometimes, the greatest betrayal isn't just the lies of others, it's the lie we tell ourselves when we ignore the truth staring us in the face. Rebecca's story is not just about revenge. It's about reclaiming power, about realizing that the person we should be fighting for the most is ourselves. It's about understanding that walking away from what no longer serves you is not failure, it's freedom. Too often, we stay in places where we aren't valued, aren't respected, aren't seen. We hold on because we are afraid of starting over. But Rebecca's journey shows us that starting over isn't the end, it's the beginning of something greater. She didn't just survive. She built something new. She didn't let betrayal define her, she defined herself. And isn't that the real lesson? You don't need to seek revenge to win. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply choosing yourself. Choosing to thrive. Choosing to build. Choosing to walk away, and never look back. Because in the end, the people who betray us may lose everything. But when we choose ourselves, we gain everything.